Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Kevin Walsh, and I've been a forest ranger at Glacier National Park for exactly 8 months when I received the call that would change everything I thought I knew about the wilderness I'd sworn to protect. It was October 15th, 2018, and the autumn air carried that sharp bite that warned of the brutal Montana winter approaching fast. The call came through at 6:23 a.m. on my Motorola XTN 446 radio, crackling with the kind of desperation that makes your stomach drop before your brain even processes the words. Ranger Station, this is emergency dispatch. We have a code yellow. Missing hiker, Ashley Turner, age 22, last seen yesterday evening on the Highline Trail near Logan Pass. I was already lacing up my Danner Mountain Light boots when the follow-up came through my cell phone. The voice belonged to Mrs. Helen Turner, Ashley's mother, and it shook with the kind of raw terror that cuts straight through radio static and lodges itself in your chest. Please, you have to find her. Ashley never misses check-ins. Never. She was supposed to call at 8 last night, then again this morning. Her GPS tracker went dead at coordinates 48.6969, died again. 130.194 degree W around 9:30 p.m. Mrs. Turner's breathing was rapid, shallow. Something's wrong. I can feel it. I grabbed my standard SAR-pack. 72 pounds of gear, including my Garmin GPS Map 60 Forest, emergency medical supplies, rope, headlamp, and 2 days' worth of MREs. The October morning tasted of pine needles and impending snow, metallic and sharp on my tongue. As the newest ranger on staff, this was my chance to prove I belonged here, that I could handle whatever the Montana wilderness threw at me. The Highline Trail stretched ahead like a ribbon carved into the mountainside. 11 miles of exposed ledges and alpine meadows that could kill you with beauty or weather in equal measure. Ashley's last known position was near Devil's Chimney, a jagged rock formation that local Blackfeet tribes had always claimed was cursed ground. I'd laughed off the stories during orientation. Ancient superstitions had no place in modern park management. The first sign something was wrong came at mile marker 7. My peripheral vision caught movement in the tree line below, a flash of red that could have been Ashley's jacket. But when I trained my binoculars on the spot, the forest revealed only the skeletal remains of aspens, their bark scarred with symbols I didn't recognize. Crude scratches that formed patterns too deliberate to be natural, too fresh to be old. The scratches resembled no wildlife marking I'd studied. They formed interlocking circles with radiating lines like something between a compass rose and a ritual symbol. My breathing became shallow and rapid, as if I couldn't pull enough air into my lungs despite the high-altitude training I'd completed just months before. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in as many minutes. I keyed my radio. Base, this is Walsh. Found unusual markings at coordinates 48.6954 degree N, 113.7201 degree W. Requesting backup for expanded search pattern. Static answered me, then silence. The trail ahead split into 3 directions. The main path continuing toward Devil's Chimney, a steep descent into Hanging Valley, and an unmarked track that wound deeper into the wilderness than any official map showed. Ashley's GPS tracker had died somewhere along that ghost trail, in terrain that shouldn't exist according to every Park Service survey conducted since 1970. I chose the unmarked path. The forest changed as I descended. Lodgepole pines gave way to something older, their trunks twisted into impossible spirals that defied every principle of botany I'd learned. The air grew thick with the smell of decomposition and something else, something that reminded me of the metallic taste gathering in my mouth. Fear sweat began trickling cold down my neck despite the mountain chill. Then I found the first shrine. Stacked stones formed a crude altar, decorated with animal bones arranged in patterns that made my vision narrow to a tunnel, everything peripheral disappearing. At the base lay Ashley's water bottle, her initials still visible through a coating of what looked like dried blood. My fingers went numb as I reached for it, no longer obeying my commands. That's when I heard the chanting. Low voices drifted through the forest, speaking words in no language I recognized but that somehow felt familiar, like half-remembered nightmares clawing their way to consciousness. The sound came from deeper in the woods, where the unmarked trail led to a clearing that appeared on no map. I should have called for backup, should have retreated to radio range and returned with a full team. Instead, I followed the voices toward whatever waited in that impossible clearing, driven by images of Ashley Turner that wouldn't leave my mind. A young woman who trusted the Park Service to keep her safe, whose mother's desperate voice still echoed in my ears. The clearing opened before me like a wound in the forest. 13 figures in hooded robes stood in a circle around a stone platform that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. In the center, Ashley Turner lay unconscious but breathing, her hiking clothes replaced by a white dress that looked like it belonged in another century. The cult members turned toward me in perfect unison, their movements synchronized in a way that violated every natural law. Beneath their hoods, their faces showed the telltale signs of the transformations I'd read about in classified reports. Reports I'd assumed were fiction until this moment. Elongated limbs, skin that rippled like liquid, eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "The new guardian arrives," spoke their leader, a woman whose voice carried the authority of someone who'd been dead for decades. Just as the prophecy foretold, what would you do in this situation? Would you keep searching or turn back? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe for more supernatural ranger stories. I realized then that I'd stumbled onto something far larger than a missing hiker case. The Disciples of the Obsidian Dawn, a cult that local law enforcement claimed had been eliminated in 1973, had never truly disappeared. They'd simply moved deeper into the wilderness, beyond the reach of official search patterns, evolving into something far worse than the human sacrifices that had originally drawn federal attention. The platform in the clearing center wasn't just stone. It was flesh that had calcified over decades, fed by ritual sacrifices and grown into a living altar that pulsed with its own heartbeat. Ashley wasn't their victim. She was their offering to whatever entity they'd been nurturing in the mountain's depths for 45 years. My training kicked in, despite the impossibility of the situation. I had two options: attempt rescue and likely die trying, or retreat and call for backup that might arrive too late. Ashley's breathing was becoming more labored with each passing moment, her life force apparently being drained by the ritual already in progress. I chose to fight. The cult members moved with inhuman speed, their transformed bodies allowing them to cover ground in ways that defied physics. But they'd grown overconfident in their isolation, unprepared for someone who'd studied every search and rescue technique the Park Service could teach. I used the terrain to my advantage, leading them into a narrow ravine where their numbers worked against them. The battle that followed violated every regulation in the Ranger Manual. I used my emergency flare gun as a weapon, my climbing rope as a snare, my knowledge of the local wildlife to create distractions that gave me precious seconds to reach Ashley. The cult members' transformations made them stronger but also clumsier, their elongated limbs catching on branches and rock formations as they pursued me through increasingly treacherous terrain. The ritual platform began to crack as I severed Ashley from whatever supernatural apparatus they'd connected her to. The living stone screamed, in sound that seemed to come from the mountain itself, causing rock slides that sealed off escape routes and forced the remaining cult members to choose between pursuing us and saving their decades of work. They chose their altar. I carried Ashley 3 miles through terrain that nearly killed us both, following GPS coordinates that led back to marked trails, just as my radio crackled back to life. The backup I'd requested hours earlier found us at Devil's Chimney, Ashley conscious but traumatized, both of us suffering from exposure and injuries that would take weeks to heal. The official report listed Ashley's disappearance as disorientation caused by altitude sickness. The cult's clearing, when investigated 2 days later, showed no signs of recent activity, only natural rock formations and normal forest growth. The unmarked trail had seemingly vanished, leaving behind only regulation Park Service paths that led exactly where the maps indicated they should. But Ashley Turner remembers everything, and so do I. The experience changed how I approach my duties as a ranger. I no longer dismiss local legends or assume that federal surveys have mapped every inch of wilderness under our protection. Some places in these mountains exist outside normal geography, harboring threats that predate European settlement by centuries and outlasting every attempt at elimination. I've been promoted twice since that October morning, eventually becoming the lead search and rescue coordinator for the northern districts. My success rate in finding missing persons has reached nearly 100%, though the methods I use don't always appear in official reports. Some rescues require tools that aren't listed in any equipment manual. Ashley Turner has become a wilderness photographer, documenting the beauty and hidden dangers of America's national parks. She volunteers for search and rescue operations, bringing skills and insights that no training program could provide. We've worked together on 17 cases since 2018, and we've never lost anyone. The disciples of the Obsidian Dawn haven't been seen since that night, but similar reports surface occasionally from rangers in other parks: Utah's Zion, Wyoming's Yellowstone, Colorado's Rocky Mountain. Groups that official records claim were eliminated decades ago, operating in territories that exist between the spaces on our maps. We watch for them, we prepare for them, and when necessary, we stop them, because that's what rangers do. We protect the people who trust us to keep them safe, whether the threats they face are natural disasters, dangerous wildlife, or ancient evils that refuse to stay buried. The wilderness teaches you that survival often depends on accepting realities that don't fit in any manual, and adapting to situations that no amount of training can fully prepare you for. My name is Kevin Walsh, and I've learned that some of the most important work we do as rangers happens in the spaces between what's officially acknowledged and what actually exists in these mountains. The badge on my uniform represents a promise to protect visitors from every danger these parks contain, even the ones that aren't supposed to be real. That's my story, and I'm still not sure I made all the right choices. What do you think? Would you have acted differently? Share your thoughts below and subscribe if you want more supernatural stories from the forest. My name is Michael Rodriguez, and I've been a forest ranger at Sequoia National Park for 12 years. In that time, I've seen everything from bear attacks to flash floods, from lost hikers to domestic disputes gone wrong in the wilderness. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I discovered in the autumn of 2018. It started with a phone call at 6:47 a.m. on October 15th. The emergency dispatch crackled through my radio as I was checking my gear in the Lodgepole Visitor Center. The familiar weight of my Motorola XTS 5000 radio clipped to my tactical vest. The call came from a woman named Patricia Mitchell, and I could hear the raw terror bleeding through the static even before dispatch relayed her words. My daughter, Sarah. She's been missing since yesterday evening. She went hiking alone on the Big Trees Trail and never came back. Please, you have to find her. The desperation in that mother's voice hit me like a physical blow. I have two daughters myself, Sophia, 16, and Isabella, 13, and the thought of either of them lost in these mountains made my throat constrict. Patricia Mitchell's fear was every parent's nightmare, and it became mine the moment I heard it. I grabbed my emergency pack, checking the contents with practiced efficiency. First aid kit, emergency shelter, extra batteries for my GPS unit, water purification tablets, signal mirror, emergency blanket. My boots, Danner Acadius, that had carried me through thousands of miles of Sierra Nevada terrain, felt heavier than usual as I headed toward my patrol vehicle. The Big Trees Trail wasn't particularly dangerous, but it connected to a maze of less traveled paths that wound deep into the sequoia groves. If Sarah had wandered off the main trail, she could be anywhere in a 20-square-mile area of dense forest. Time was critical. October nights in the high country dropped below freezing, and hypothermia could set in quickly. I met Patricia Mitchell at the Crescent Meadow parking area. She was a woman in her early 50s with graying brown hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. Her hiking boots were caked with mud, and her jacket was torn in two places. She'd clearly been searching through the night herself. When she saw my ranger uniform, her face crumpled with relief and renewed hope. "Sarah's 23, she said, her voice shaking as she handed me a recent photo. She's a graduate student at UC Davis studying forestry. She knows the woods, but she's been under a lot of stress lately with her thesis. I'm worried she might have taken risks she normally wouldn't. The photo showed a young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes, wearing a UC Davis sweatshirt. She looked so much like my Isabella might in 10 years that my chest tightened. I studied the image carefully, memorizing every detail. "When did you last hear from her?" I asked, pulling out my incident report notebook. "Yesterday around 4:30 p.m., she texted me a photo of some sequoia bark patterns, something about her research, then nothing. Her phone goes straight to voicemail now." I nodded, making notes. Cell coverage in the deep groves was spotty at best. "What was she wearing?" "Red fleece jacket, dark jeans, brown hiking boots. She had a small blue backpack with water and some granola bars. And her camera, she never goes anywhere without her Nikon." I radioed dispatch for additional support and began organizing a systematic search. My supervisor, Chief Ranger Williams, authorized 2 additional rangers and requested a helicopter for aerial reconnaissance when weather permitted. But as the morning fog rolled through the giant sequoias like smoke from some ancient fire, I knew aerial support would be limited. The Big Trees Trail was a well-maintained path that wound through some of the most spectacular sequoia groves in the park. I started at the trailhead looking for any sign of Sarah's passage. The trail was popular enough that dozens of footprints marked the soft earth, making individual tracking nearly impossible. But about half a mile in, I found something that made me stop. A piece of red fabric, no bigger than my thumb, was caught on a manzanita bush about 15 feet off the main trail. The fabric was from a fleece jacket, the same color Patricia had described. But it was the location that bothered me. The bush was positioned where someone would have to deliberately push through dense undergrowth to reach it. No casual hiker would have wandered that far off the trail by accident. I marked the GPS coordinates, 36.5697 degree on N, 118.7745 degree on W, and followed the barely visible path through the brush. The route led away from the main trail system, deeper into the old-growth forest where massive sequoias created a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the morning light into golden shafts. After about 200 yards, I found her first footprint in a patch of soft earth beside a fallen log. The tread pattern matched the boots Patricia had described, morel hiking boots with a distinctive waffle sole. But the print was deep, pressed into the soil with more force than normal walking would create. Sarah had been running. My handheld radio crackled. "Unit 47, this is dispatch. Be advised we have a secondary concern regarding the missing hiker. UC Davis contacted us about Sarah Mitchell's research focus. She's been studying historical land use patterns, specifically related to early settlement sites. Some of her research involved controversial historical events." Copy, dispatch. "What kind of controversial events?" "Cult activity from the 1970s, the Crimson Dawn Collective. They were active in that area before federal intervention disbanded them in 1979. Sarah's been researching their environmental impact for her thesis." The name sent an icy finger down my spine. I'd heard whispers about the Crimson Dawn from older rangers, stories told in hushed voices around campfires. A religious cult that had established a compound somewhere in the park's backcountry before the land was officially designated. They'd been involved in unsavory practices, animal sacrifices, possibly worse. The FBI had raided their compound nearly 40 years ago, but the exact location had been deliberately obscured in official records. I followed Sarah's trail deeper into the forest, the sequoias growing larger and older around me. Some of these giants had been standing for over 2,000 years, silent witnesses to everything that had happened in their shadow. The air grew colder as I moved further from the main trail, and a strange smell began to permeate the forest. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of overripe fruit mixed with smoke. Another footprint, this one showing a stumble. Sarah had caught herself with her hand against a tree trunk, leaving a small smudge of what looked like blood on the bark. My pulse quickened. She was injured, possibly being pursued. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath. Normal woodland sounds, the chatter of squirrels, the distant call of Steller's jays had faded to an unnatural silence. Even my radio had gone quiet, picking up only static when I tried to check in with dispatch. I found her camera about a quarter-mile further in. The Nikon D7500 was lying in a patch of ferns, its LCD screen cracked but the camera itself apparently undamaged. I carefully bagged it as evidence, but not before checking the last few photos on the memory card. Most were botanical shots, bark patterns, leaf structures, lichen formations, academic documentation. But the final photo made my breath catch. It showed a structure I'd never seen in 12 years of patrolling these forests. A wooden framework, maybe 8 feet tall, constructed from rough-hewn logs and positioned in a small clearing. The structure formed an inverted cross, and something dark was draped across the crossbeam. The photo was taken from a distance, slightly blurred, as if Sarah had been moving when she captured it. But the image was clear enough to see ropes hanging from the framework, and what looked like dried bloodstains on the wood. I immediately radioed for backup, but my transmission was swallowed by static. The radio display showed full signal strength, but something was interfering with communications. I tried my cell phone, no service, which wasn't unusual in the deep forest, but the timing felt ominous. Following the direction indicated by the camera's viewfinder angle, I pushed through a thick stand of young sequoias and emerged into the clearing Sarah had photographed. The wooden structure dominated the space, roughly constructed but sturdy, positioned at the exact center of the clearing like some primitive altar. Up close, I could see that the dark stains weren't just on the wood. They soaked into the earth around the base in patterns that suggested repeated use. Fresh boot prints circled the structure, multiple sets, all wearing different tread patterns. Some were recent, made within the last day or two based on their sharp edges and lack of debris. Others were older but still relatively fresh. Someone had been using this place regularly. But it was what I found at the base of the inverted cross that made my hands shake as I photographed the evidence. A small pile of personal belongings, a woman's hiking boot, a torn piece of denim, a silver bracelet, and a UC Davis student ID card with Sarah Mitchell's photo. Sarah had been here, and she hadn't left on her own. I heard them before I saw them. Voices, low and rhythmic, drifting through the trees from somewhere deeper in the forest. At first, I thought it might be a search party, other rangers looking for Sarah, but the cadence was wrong. The voices rose and fell in unison, like a chant or prayer, and the words weren't English, or at least not any English I recognized. Every instinct screamed at me to wait for backup, to retreat and return with a full team. But the voices meant people. And people might mean Sarah was still alive. If there was even a chance she was being held somewhere close by, I couldn't wait. Not when every minute might be the difference between life and death. I followed the sound deeper into the forest, moving as quietly as possible through the undergrowth. My Glock 22 was secured in its holster, and I kept one hand near it as I advanced. The chanting grew louder, more distinct, and I began to make out individual words. Latin, maybe, or something that sounded like it. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost trance-like. The trees opened into another clearing, larger than the first, and what I saw there violated everything I thought I knew about this forest. A dozen people stood in a circle around a fire pit, their heads covered by dark hoods that obscured their faces. They wore simple brown robes that looked hand-stitched, and their feet were bare despite the cold ground. The chanting came from all of them at once, a low harmonic drone that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. But it was what lay at the center of their circle that made me forget every protocol I'd ever learned. Sarah Mitchell was there, but not as I'd expected to find her. She was alive. I could see her chest rising and falling. But she was bound to a wooden frame similar to the inverted cross in the previous clearing. This one was upright, like a crude X, and Sarah's arms and legs were spread and tied to the frame with thick rope. Her red fleece jacket had been removed, leaving her in just a thin t-shirt and jeans. Even from my hiding position 30 yards away, I could see she was unconscious, her head lolling forward. At this point, I should have turned back. Every ranger knows you don't engage multiple suspects alone, especially when they're armed, and you don't know their intentions. But seeing Sarah bound and helpless triggered something primal in me, something that went beyond training and protocol. She was somebody's daughter, and if something happened to her because I chose caution over action, I'd never forgive myself. What would you do in this situation? Would you keep searching or turn back? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe for more Supernatural Ranger stories. I drew my sidearm and activated my emergency beacon, hoping it would penetrate whatever was interfering with radio communications. Then I moved closer, using the massive sequoia trunks as cover. 20 yards. 15. 10. That's when I got my first clear look at the people in the circle, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. They weren't people. Not exactly. Oh, they had human shapes, human postures, human voices. But their skin was wrong. Too pale, almost translucent, with dark veins visible beneath the surface like ink spreading through water. And their hands, which I could see clearly as they gestured in time with their chanting, ended in fingers that were too long, too thin, with nails that curved into points. But it was their eyes that convinced me I was looking at something that had no business existing in the rational world. When one of them turned in my direction, I caught a glimpse beneath the hood of eyes that reflected light like an animal's, glowing with an inner phosphorescence that shifted from pale green to deep amber. The Crimson Dawn cult hadn't just disbanded in 1979. They'd become something else. I'd stumbled into a nightmare that had been hiding in these forests for decades, feeding on whatever unlucky hikers wandered too far from the marked trails. Sarah wasn't their first victim, and if I didn't act, she wouldn't be their last. The chanting reached a crescendo, and I watched in horror as one of the figures approached Sarah with something glinting in its two long fingers. A knife, the blade catching the firelight as it moved. Sarah stirred, her head lifting slightly, and I saw her eyes open wide with terror as she realized where she was. I didn't make a conscious decision to act. Training, instinct, and pure parental rage took over. "Federal Ranger! Everyone on the ground now!" I shouted, stepping out from behind the sequoia with my weapon drawn and trained on the figure with the knife. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Every hooded head turned toward me in perfect unison, and the chanting stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, and the rapid beating of my heart against my ribs. Then they began to move. Not running, not walking, flowing. Like liquid shadow given form, they moved toward me with a grace that was utterly inhuman. The one with the knife was fastest, covering the distance between us in seconds that felt like slow motion. I fired twice center mass just as I'd been trained. Both shots found their target punching through the brown robe and spinning the figure around. It didn't fall. It didn't even slow down. Instead, it looked down at the holes in its chest with what might have been curiosity, then continued advancing. I could see dark fluid seeping from the wounds, but it wasn't blood. It was thick and viscous, like motor oil, and it reflected the firelight with an iridescent sheen. I fired again, this time at the head. The shot took off the hood and revealed what had once been a human face, now twisted into something that belonged in a fever dream. The features were elongated, stretched like putty, and the mouth opened too wide, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. The bullet punched through its forehead and out the back of its skull, spraying black ichor across the ground. This time it fell, but the others kept coming. I emptied my magazine into the approaching figures, watching bullet after bullet find their marks with no visible effect. When the slide locked back, I dropped the empty mag and slammed in my spare, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. There were too many of them, and conventional weapons seemed useless against whatever they'd become. That's when Sarah screamed. Not a scream of fear or pain, but something else entirely. Something that cut through the air like a physical force and made every fiber in my body vibrate. The advancing figures stopped mid-stride, their heads turning back toward her with expressions of what looked like confusion. Sarah was no longer unconscious. Her eyes were open, but they weren't the same eyes I'd seen in the photograph her mother had shown me. These eyes glowed with the same phosphorescent light as the cult members, but the color was different. Where theirs shifted between green and amber, hers blazed with pure silver radiance. "You have no power here," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that seemed impossible from a human throat. "Your time is finished. Return to the darkness you crawled from." The cult members, or whatever they'd become, recoiled as if she'd struck them physically. Several fell to their knees, while others backed away toward the edge of the clearing. The one I'd shot in the head was already regenerating, the wound closing with wet, sucking sounds, but even it seemed afraid to approach Sarah now. "The blood pact is broken," Sarah continued, straining against her bonds. "The forest rejects you. I reject you." That's when I understood. Sarah hadn't just been researching the Crimson Dawn cult for her thesis. She'd been hunting them, and somehow, in whatever twisted ritual they'd been performing, she'd turned their own power against them. The ropes binding her to the wooden frame began to smoke and char, falling away as if burned through by invisible fire. Sarah stepped down from the frame, her feet touching the ground with a sound like thunder. The silver glow around her intensified, and I had to shield my eyes as she raised her hands toward the fleeing cult members. What happened next defied every law of physics I'd ever learned. The ground beneath the cult members' feet began to crack and split, revealing not soil and stone but empty darkness that seemed to stretch down forever. One by one, they fell, or were pulled, into those cracks, their screams fading as they disappeared into whatever void had opened to swallow them. When the last of them vanished, the cracks sealed themselves, leaving only scorched earth where they'd been. The silver radiance around Sarah flickered and faded, and she collapsed to her knees, suddenly looking very human and very exhausted. I holstered my weapon and ran to her, my training finally reasserting itself. She was conscious but weak, suffering from exposure and dehydration but otherwise unharmed. As I wrapped her in my emergency blanket and radioed for medical evacuation, my radio worked perfectly now. She looked up at me with normal brown eyes and smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. I wasn't sure I could hold them long enough for someone to find me. "Hold them?" I asked, helping her to her feet. "The binding ritual. They needed a specific type of person, someone with the right bloodline, the right sensitivity. But they didn't realize that bloodline worked both ways. I could channel the forest's power just as well as they could corrupt it." She paused, looking around the empty clearing. My great-grandmother was one of the original rangers who helped shut down the Crimson Dawn compound. She left me certain instructions, just in case they ever came back. 3 hours later, as the helicopter lifted Sarah and me out of the forest, I looked down at the sequoia groves and saw them as they truly were. Not just a wilderness preserve, but a living entity with its own form of consciousness. Something that had been wounded by the Crimson Dawn decades ago and had finally found a way to heal itself. Sarah recovered fully, completed her thesis, and went on to become a park ranger herself. She never spoke publicly about what happened in that clearing, and neither did I. Some stories are too dangerous to tell, too impossible for most people to believe. But I know the truth. The forest itself chose Sarah to be its champion, just as it had chosen her great-grandmother before her. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of Sequoia National Park, ancient powers still stir, watching and waiting for anyone foolish enough to threaten the balance between the human world and the deeper mysteries that lurk in the shadows between the trees. My name is Michael Rodriguez, and I've been a forest ranger for 14 years now. I've seen things that would challenge anyone's understanding of reality, but I've also learned that sometimes the wilderness has its own ways of protecting itself, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, it chooses to protect you too. As for the Crimson Dawn cult, their compound was never found despite extensive searches. But sometimes when I'm patrolling the deepest parts of the forest, I catch a whiff of that sweet, cloying smell that reminds me of overripe fruit mixed with smoke. When that happens, I make sure to radio in my position and keep moving. Because even though Sarah banished them back to whatever darkness spawned them, I've learned that some evils are patient enough to wait for the right opportunity to return. The forest remembers everything. And now, so do I. Did you enjoy this supernatural encounter? What would you have done differently? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying tales from the wilderness. My name is Ryan O'Brien, and I've been a forest ranger at Olympic National Park for 12 years. What I'm about to tell you happened in October 2018, 3 weeks after I buried my 8-year-old daughter, Emma. The department insisted I take compassionate leave, but staying home just meant staring at her empty bedroom door. The forest had always been my sanctuary. I thought it still could be. I was wrong. The call came in at 0547 hours on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Coffee that tasted like burnt metal, the weight of my gear vest pulling at shoulders that hadn't relaxed since the funeral, and the familiar ritual of checking my Motorola XTN 600 radio. Sector 7 was supposed to be routine patrol. Fallen trees from the weekend storm, maybe a few stranded hikers who'd ignored the weather warnings. Ranger O'Brien, this is dispatch, we've got a situation. Maria's voice crackled through the static, and something in her tone made the hairs on my forearm stand straight up. Go ahead, dispatch. Cold case just got hot. Remember Ethan Moore? Disappeared October 2016, never found. My breath caught. Every ranger in the Pacific Northwest knew about Ethan Moore. 24 years old, experienced hiker, vanished without a trace on the Hurricane Ridge Trail. We'd searched for 2 weeks straight. Dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging, nothing. His parents had eventually accepted he'd fallen into one of the deep ravines, maybe been dragged away by wildlife. Case went cold. What's the development, Maria? Hiker found his backpack this morning, North Fork Quinault Trail, about 6 miles in. Here's the weird part, Ryan. The pack looks like it was dropped yesterday. No weather damage, no animal chewing. And there's... She paused, and I could hear papers rustling. There's fresh blood on the straps. My fingers tightened around the radio until my knuckles went white. The North Fork Trail was nowhere near Hurricane Ridge. That was 15 miles of dense forest and 2 river crossings. No way a backpack sits undisturbed for 2 years, then suddenly appears in perfect condition. I'm en route. What's my backup situation? You're flying solo today. Jenkins called in sick. Martinez is dealing with that bear problem near Lake Cushman. Can you handle this? I should have said no. Should have waited for backup. Followed protocol. But Emma's voice echoed in my head. The way she'd always asked me to tell her ranger stories. Eyes wide with wonder about the mysteries hiding in the deep woods. Finding answers had become my obsession since losing her. I can handle it. The drive to North Fork Quinault took 43 minutes. My Ford Ranger churning through mud and fallen branches left by the storm. October in Olympic was brutal. Temperatures dropping into the 30s at night. Daylight fading by 6 p.m. The Douglas firs towered over everything like ancient sentinels, their branches so thick they blocked most of the sky. Even at midday, the forest floor stayed trapped in perpetual twilight. I found the civilian who'd discovered the pack waiting at the trailhead. Jerry Hutchins, 62, retired Boeing engineer, pale as parchment and shaking despite his heavy jacket. I've been hiking these trails for 30 years, Jerry told me, his voice barely above a whisper. Never seen anything like this. The pack was sitting right in the middle of the trail, like someone had placed it there on purpose. He led me to the location, exactly 3.7 miles in, according to my GPS. The trail curved around a massive cedar trunk, and there it was. Navy blue JanSport backpack, sitting upright against a moss-covered boulder. The fabric looked factory fresh, no fading, no water stains, no tears from thorns or animal claws. But the blood was real. Dark crimson streaks across the shoulder straps, still tacky to the touch. My latex gloves came away sticky. The metallic smell hit the back of my throat, mixing with the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the sharp bite of cedar sap. Did you touch anything? I asked Jerry. Just enough to check the name tag. Soon as I saw Ethan Moore, I backed away and called you guys. I photographed everything from 6 different angles, then carefully opened the main compartment. Inside, energy bars with 2016 expiration dates, a water bottle still half full, a park map with Hurricane Ridge circled in red ink, and a digital camera. The camera's timestamp showed the last photo taken on October 15, 2016 at 14:32. The image made my stomach drop. It was Ethan, smiling at the camera, but the background wasn't Hurricane Ridge. It was this exact spot. The same boulder, The same cedar tree, the same curve in the trail. But that was impossible. This trail hadn't existed in 2016. The North Fork extension was built in spring 2017. My radio buzzed. O'Brien status report. Pack recovered. Sending photos to headquarters. Maria, I need you to pull the construction records for North Fork Quinault Trail extension. Copy that. Anything else? I stared at the photo display on the camera, scrolling through dozens of images. All of them showed Ethan in locations that shouldn't have existed when he disappeared. My throat felt lined with sandpaper. Yeah, I'm going to need that backup after all. But as I keyed the radio to confirm, static filled the channel. No response. I checked my signal. 0 bars. That was strange. Cell towers dotted the Olympic Peninsula specifically to prevent dead zones in high-traffic areas. Jerry had already started hiking back toward the parking area, claiming his arthritis was acting up. I didn't blame him. Something felt wrong about this place. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no scurrying of small animals through the underbrush. Even the wind had died to nothing. I continued deeper into the trail, following Ethan's GPS coordinates from the camera's metadata. The path meandered through old-growth forest, past nurse logs thick as school buses and streams that sparkled like broken glass. But every 100 yards or so, I found another piece of evidence. A water bottle cap, bright blue plastic that should have been bleached white by 2 years of weather. A granola bar wrapper that crinkled like it had just been opened. A torn piece of flannel shirt caught on a low branch, the fabric still holding the scent of human sweat, and something else. Something chemical and sharp that reminded me of hospital disinfectant. The trail ended at a clearing I'd never seen before, though I'd supposedly patrolled this sector dozens of times. 50 yards of flat ground surrounded by a perfect circle of Douglas firs, like nature had carved out an amphitheater. In the center sat a concrete structure half buried under decades of moss and fern growth. It looked like a bunker. My boots squelched through mud as I approached. The concrete was old, military grade, with the faded remnants of yellow radiation symbols stenciled near what appeared to be an entrance. Rust-eaten steel doors hung open on broken hinges, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. The smell hit me like a physical blow. Rotting meat mixed with chemicals, ozone, and something else. Something that made the primitive part of my brain scream warnings about predators and death. I should have left. Should have marked the coordinates and called for a full investigation team. But Emma's voice whispered in my memory. Dad, what's the scariest thing you ever found in the forest? I'd always told her there was nothing to fear in the woods. That rangers were there to protect people, to solve mysteries, to bring families closure. I'd lied to my daughter my entire life, and now she was gone. The least I could do was find out what happened to Ethan Moore. I drew my service weapon, a Glock 22 that felt pathetically inadequate against whatever was hiding in that bunker, and descended into the dark. The stairs were metal grating, corroded, but still solid. My flashlight revealed walls lined with pipes and electrical conduits, most of them dark with age and moisture. Emergency lighting fixtures hung from the ceiling like dead insects. 20 steps down, the stairs ended at a long corridor that stretched beyond my light's reach. Doors lined both sides of the hallway. Most were sealed, but 3 stood open. The first room contained banks of computer equipment from the 1980s, screens dark, keyboards yellow with age. Papers scattered across the floor showed partial text, Project Prometheus classification level, and subjects showing unprecedented adaptability. The second room was living quarters, bunk beds, lockers, a small kitchen area, everything covered in that thick, moist moss that grew in places where sunlight never penetrated. But the beds had been slept in recently, sheets pulled back, pillows still bearing the impression of human heads. It was the third room that made me understand why they'd abandoned this place. Cages. Dozens of them, each one large enough to hold a person. The metal bars were bent outward, twisted like taffy by something with incredible strength. Scratch marks gouged deep into the concrete walls, not from human fingernails, but from claws that must have been 6 inches long. A clipboard hung from a nail beside the door. The top sheet was a medical evaluation form dated September 23, 1987. Patient designation, Subject 7. Notes in careful handwriting. Demonstrates enhanced physical capabilities. Bone density increased 340%. Muscle mass doubled. Intelligence quotient now estimated above 200. Recommend immediate termination of experiment. Subject has begun showing signs of aggressive territoriality and predatory behavior. Beneath that, someone had scrawled in red ink, "Too late, it got out." My hands shook as I photographed the document. Whatever they'd been doing here in the 80s, whatever Subject 7 was, it had escaped. The question was whether it was still alive after 31 years. The answer came as I turned to leave the room. Ethan Moore stood in the doorway. At least it had been Ethan once. The thing wearing his face was 7 feet tall, its limbs stretched and distorted like a funhouse mirror reflection. Its skin had a gray, mottled texture that looked more reptilian than human. But the worst part was its eyes. Still unmistakably Ethan's warm brown eyes, but filled with an intelligence that was alien and predatory. "Hello, Ranger O'Brien," it said in Ethan's voice, though the words seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I've been waiting for someone to find my old home." My gun was in my hand, though I didn't remember drawing it. The creature that had been Ethan tilted its head with inhuman curiosity. "That won't help you," it continued. "I've learned so much since they made me. About biology, about evolution, about what humans can become with the right adjustments. What happened to you? I found this place 2 years ago, just like you did. I was looking for a shortcut back to my car, got turned around in the dark. The door was already open. I was curious." Its lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. They left so many interesting things behind. Computers full of research data, genetic samples in cryogenic storage, and the transformation chamber still worked perfectly. I understood then why the backpack had appeared fresh, why the blood was still wet. This thing had been using Ethan's belongings as bait, drawing searchers to this place. How many hikers had vanished over the past 2 years? How many had found their way down here, only to become part of whatever sick experiment was still running? "What do you want?" I managed to ask. "Company," it said simply. "The process is quite remarkable, but it's terribly lonely. The researchers were so concerned with physical enhancement, they never considered the psychological implications. Do you know what it's like to be the only one of your kind?" The creature stepped closer, and I could smell the chemical reek of its altered metabolism. Behind it, other figures moved in the shadows of the corridor. More twisted forms that might once have been human. "Your daughter would have made an excellent subject," it continued, and my vision went red. 8 years old, the optimal age for skeletal modification. Such a pity about the cancer. I emptied my clip into its chest. The bullets punched holes through its torso, black fluid spraying across the concrete walls. But it just looked down at the wounds with mild interest, watching them seal themselves closed. "Enhanced healing factor," it explained conversationally. "One of the more useful improvements. Though I must say your emotional response was quite predictable. Grief makes humans so wonderfully irrational." That's when I remembered the emergency protocols from my first year as a ranger. Every government facility built during the Cold War had the same fail-safe system. I'd seen the documentation during orientation. If containment was breached, if experiments went wrong, there was always a way to sterilize the site. The control panel was 50 yards back down the corridor, hidden behind a locked cover marked with radiation warnings. My lockpicking kit got me through the simple mechanism in 30 seconds. Inside was a single red button labeled Emergency Containment Protocol, Authorization Required. I didn't have authorization. I wasn't military, wasn't a scientist, wasn't anyone important enough to make this kind of decision. But Emma's face floated in my memory, and I thought about how many other children would never get the chance to grow up if these things escaped into the wider world. The creature calling itself Ethan was still talking, explaining the intricacies of genetic modification, while its companions closed in from both ends of the hallway. I tuned it out and focused on the small text below the button. "Activation initiates thermal sterilization sequence. Facility will be sealed and heated to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. All biological matter will be eliminated. I pressed the button. Alarm started screaming immediately. Red lights flashed along the corridor, and a computerized voice began counting down from 10 minutes. The creatures suddenly stopped their casual approach, the predatory intelligence in their eyes replaced by very human panic. "What have you done?" Ethan's voice had lost its conversational tone. "My job," I said, and ran for the stairs. I made it to the surface with 3 minutes to spare. Behind me, the bunker sealed itself with blast doors that rose from the ground like metal curtains. The creatures threw themselves against the barriers, their enhanced strength useless against steel designed to contain nuclear weapons. The thermal pulse, when it came, was visible even through the earth. A flash of white light erupted from ventilation shafts, followed by a low rumble that shook the trees. Superheated air vented through hidden outlets, turning the morning mist into steam. It was over in 60 seconds. The clearing fell silent except for the normal sounds of forest life returning. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, wind moving through the branches. Nature filling the vacuum left by something unnatural. My radio crackled back to life as I reached the main trail. "O'Brien, where the hell have you been? We lost contact for over 6 hours. 6 hours. It had felt like 30 minutes, but my watch confirmed it. The sun was setting, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber. "I found Ethan Moore," I radioed back. "Case closed." What would you do in this situation? Would you keep searching or turn back? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe for more supernatural ranger stories. I filed my report as a routine recovery operation. Hiker remains located and cremated due to advanced decomposition and biohazard concerns. The backpack went into evidence storage with the other personal effects that families never quite knew how to process. I never mentioned the bunker, never mentioned Subject 7 or the transformation chamber or the fact that somewhere in a classified filing cabinet, government researchers were probably still wondering what happened to their most successful experiment. The official story was that Ethan had fallen into a sinkhole that subsequently collapsed, sealing his remains underground. Natural causes, case closed, family gets closure. Sometimes the truth isn't worth the questions it would raise, but I knew better. I'd seen what happens when humans try to improve on evolution, when scientific curiosity overrides ethical constraints. I'd seen what we become when we surrender our humanity in pursuit of perfection. The cost of that knowledge was higher than I'd expected. The nightmare started 3 days later. Visions of Emma transformed, her sweet laugh replaced by something predatory and cold. My marriage ended 2 months after that, Sarah claiming I'd become a different person, distant and paranoid. She wasn't wrong. The man who'd descended into that bunker wasn't the same one who came out. I'd saved the world from something monstrous, but I'd become monstrous myself in the process. The kind of person who could incinerate living beings without hesitation, who could lie to grieving families, who could sleep soundly knowing he'd made the hardest choice possible. 6 months later, I transferred to a desk job in Olympia. No more forest patrols, no more mysterious disappearances, no more chances to discover things that should stay buried. I tell myself it's enough, that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. But late at night, when the city is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I remember the creature's words about loneliness, about being the only one of its kind, and I wonder if Subject 7 was really the last of them, or if there are other facilities out there, other experiments that succeeded. I wonder if somewhere in the deep woods enhanced humans are still evolving, still waiting for the right moment to reclaim a world they think they've outgrown. And I wonder if the next ranger who finds evidence of their existence will have the strength to do what needs to be done. That's my story, and I'm still not sure I made the right choices. What do you think? Would you have acted differently? Share your thoughts below and subscribe if you want more paranormal ranger experiences. My name is Ryan O'Brien, and these are the things we never talk about in the service. The prices we pay for keeping the world safe from what's hiding in the dark places. The choices that haunt us long after the case files are sealed. Some secrets are worth keeping, even when they destroy us in the process. My name is Emily Carter, and I've been a forest ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington for 12 years. What I'm about to tell you happened in October 2018, but the seeds of this nightmare were planted 3 years earlier when I encountered something in these woods that the brass made me promise never to speak about. They said it was classified. They said it was for national security. They said a lot of things, but they never said it was over. I should have known better when Detective Mills from Port Angeles PD called that gray Tuesday morning, his voice tight with something between excitement and dread. Madison Clark's case file had been sitting in a dusty box for 8 years, a missing college student who vanished during a solo camping trip in the Hoh River Valley. 20 years old, blonde, last seen at the Salt Duke Hot Springs Visitor Center buying trail mix and asking about backcountry permits. "We found something, Carter," Mills said, and I could hear him rustling papers through the phone. "Hiker discovered Madison's backpack yesterday, about 6 miles up the Hoh River Trail. Problem is, it wasn't there 3 weeks ago when Search and Rescue did their annual sweep of that exact area." My coffee mug paused halfway to my lips, steam curling up into the fluorescent lights of the ranger station. 8-year-old evidence doesn't just materialize. The muscles between my shoulder blades began to tighten, a familiar tension that had nothing to do with bad posture and everything to do with the memories I'd spent 3 years trying to bury. "You sure about the timeline?" I asked, though I already knew Mills was meticulous. He'd been the lead detective on Madison's case from the beginning, and it had haunted him the way some cases do, the ones that don't make sense, the ones that leave too many questions. "Positive. GPS coordinates logged, photos documented. Carter, there's something else." His voice dropped. "The backpack. It's in perfect condition. No weather damage, no animal interference. Like it was placed there yesterday." I set down my coffee cup with hands that had started to tremble. Through the station window, Olympic's ancient Douglas firs swayed in a wind I couldn't hear, their branches creating shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. 3 years ago, I'd learned that some shadows in these woods had nothing to do with trees. "I'll be there in an hour," I said, already reaching for my gear. The Hoh River Trail stretched into the forest like a gray tongue, swallowed by cedars and hemlocks that had been growing since before Columbus. I'd walked this path hundreds of times, knew every route that might catch an ankle, every creek crossing that turned treacherous after rain. But today, the familiar felt foreign. The air tasted different, metallic, like the moment before lightning strikes. Mills was waiting at mile marker 6 with 2 Port Angeles officers and a crime scene photographer. The backpack sat on a makeshift evidence tarp, a splash of pink fabric against the dark earth. REI brand barely faded, with Madison Clark's name written in black Sharpie on the internal tag. I pulled on latex gloves and crouched beside it, my knees popping in the October cold. No tears, no claw marks, I observed, running my fingers along the zippers. Hell, the buckles aren't even dirty. "Gets weirder," Mills said, consulting his notebook. "Contents are exactly what her roommate said she packed. Granola bars with expiration dates from 2010, water bottle still sealed, sleeping bag that smells like her fabric softener. Even found her journal." He handed me a small, spiral-bound notebook, pages filled with Madison's careful handwriting. I flipped to the last entry, dated 3 days before her disappearance. Day 2 in the backcountry. Something's not right here. The other campers at Salt Duke mentioned seeing lights in the forest that don't belong. Military helicopters during the night. Jake thinks I'm paranoid, but I swear someone's been watching our campsite. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. Military helicopters. 3 years ago, I'd seen those same helicopters, black and unmarked, landing in a restricted area 15 miles northwest of here. I'd been investigating reports of strange animal behavior when I stumbled onto something that still gave me nightmares. A research facility that officially didn't exist, conducting experiments that officially never happened. "Mills," I said carefully, "I need to see the exact location where this was found." The spot was unremarkable, a small clearing beside the trail where hikers often stopped to rest. But as I knelt in the damp leaves, something caught my eye. Pressed into the earth were tracks, but not from any animal in these woods. three-toed with elongated digits that ended in what looked like claws. Each print was nearly 8 inches long, pressed deep enough to suggest something much heavier than a human, but it was the spacing between the tracks that made my throat tighten. They were too far apart for a bipedal gait, but there were only 2 lines of prints. Whatever made these moved on 2 legs and had a stride length of nearly 4 feet. "You getting this?" I called to the photographer, pointing at the tracks. He nodded, but when I looked at his camera display, the tracks weren't visible. Just an empty patch of forest floor. "Try again," I said, my voice sharper than intended. Same result. The tracks that I could see clear as day simply didn't exist in the photographs. This was the kind of thing that had gotten me in trouble 3 years ago. Seeing evidence that technology couldn't confirm, reporting incidents that created files marked classified, and conversations that ended with warnings about my career. Mills walked over, squinting at the ground where I was pointing. "Carter, I don't see anything." But I did, and I was starting to remember why I'd requested a transfer out of the backcountry after my last encounter with the impossible. Some things in these woods didn't want to be found. Some things in these woods shouldn't be found. "Let's expand the search perimeter," I said, standing and brushing dirt from my knees. If Madison's backpack appeared here after 8 years, maybe there's other evidence. We spread out in a 50-yard radius, but it was my partner Rodriguez who made the next discovery. He'd been with the Park Service for 6 months, transferred from Yellowstone with recommendations that praised his tracking skills and attention to detail. Those skills were about to be tested. "Emily," he called from a cluster of old-growth cedars, "you need to see this." What he'd found was a campsite, not visible from the trail, hidden behind a natural screen of fallen logs and Devil's Club, but clearly used recently. A ring of stones circled cold ashes, and around the perimeter someone had constructed what looked like warning markers, skulls and bones from forest animals, arranged in patterns that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. But it was what hung from the cedar branches that made Rodriguez step back, his face pale despite his naturally dark complexion. Pieces of fabric, shredded and bloody, hung like prayer flags in the still air. And threaded through them like some macabre art installation were human teeth. "Jesus," Rodriguez whispered. "How many people?" I counted carefully, my ranger training overriding the part of my brain that wanted to run. 12 incisors, 8 canines, 16 molars. More than one person, but the teeth weren't old. Some still had roots attached with tissue that looked fresh. Very fresh. Mills appeared at my shoulder, took one look at the display, and immediately got on his radio. "This is Detective Mills, badge number 44701. I need a forensics team at the Hoh River Trail, mile marker 6, approximately 200 yards southeast of the trail. We have what appears to be multiple homicide evidence." While Mills coordinated with his department, I studied the campsite more carefully. The arrangement wasn't random. The bone markers formed a rough circle, and within that circle the ground was different. Not just disturbed, it was darker, almost black, as if something had soaked into the earth over time. I pulled out my multi-tool and scraped away the surface layer. The smell that rose up made Rodriguez gag and step away. It was organic decay, but wrong somehow. Not the clean decomposition of forest litter, but something sweet and corrupt, like meat left in the sun. And beneath the black earth, something gleamed white. "Mills," I called. "We need to stop digging and call this in to the FBI. This isn't just a local missing person case anymore." But even as I said it, I knew the federal authorities wouldn't find what I was seeing, just like the tracks that didn't photograph, just like the shadows that moved independently of their sources. This was connected to my classified encounter 3 years ago, and that meant whatever was happening here operated outside normal investigative channels. As if summoned by my thoughts, the sound of helicopter rotors began to echo through the forest canopy. But these weren't Coast Guard search and rescue helicopters. These were the unmarked black aircraft I remembered from 3 years ago, appearing with the kind of timing that suggested someone had been monitoring our radio communications. "Everyone needs to step away from the campsite," I said, my voice carrying the authority of 12 years in the wilderness. "Now." Mills looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Carter, this is an active crime scene. We're not..." The first helicopter touched down in the clearing beside the trail, and 6 figures in black tactical gear emerged before the rotors had fully stopped. No unit patches, no name tags, no badges. Just the kind of professional efficiency that suggested military training and authority that didn't require explanation. The leader approached our group with the measured pace of someone accustomed to compliance. Mid-40s, gray hair cropped short, eyes that took in everything and revealed nothing. When he spoke, his voice carried a slight southern accent and the tone of someone who expected to be obeyed. "I'm Agent Cross with the Department of Interior's Special Investigations Unit. This area is now under federal jurisdiction. I need everyone to gather their equipment and return to the trailhead immediately." Mills stepped forward, his detective badge held high. "This is a Port Angeles PD investigation into a missing person case. You can't just—" "Detective Mills," Cross interrupted, somehow knowing the man's name without having seen identification. "Madison Clark's disappearance intersects with an ongoing national security matter. Your cooperation is appreciated and mandatory." I watched this exchange with growing dread, remembering how my own encounter 3 years ago had been classified and buried. The same polite efficiency, the same non-negotiable authority, the same suggestion that some questions were too dangerous to ask. But this time I wasn't going to walk away. "Agent Cross," I said, stepping forward. "I'm Senior Ranger Emily Carter. I've been working these woods for 12 years, and I think Madison Clark stumbled onto something she shouldn't have seen. If you want my cooperation, I need to know what we're dealing with." Cross studied me for a long moment, and I had the unsettling feeling he was accessing files in his head, reviewing information about me that I'd hoped was buried. Finally, he nodded. "Ranger Carter, you're coming with us. Everyone else returns to the trailhead and submits to debriefing. What happens here doesn't get discussed, doesn't get reported, and doesn't get remembered. Is that clear?" Mills started to protest, but Cross's team was already moving, herding the local law enforcement back toward the trail with professional politeness that brooked no argument. Within minutes, I was alone with 6 federal agents in a forest that suddenly felt much larger and much more dangerous. "3 years ago," Cross said once the others were gone, "you filed a report about unusual activity in the restricted zone near Blue Glacier. That report was classified and you were reassigned. Do you remember why?" Of course I remembered. I'd been tracking elk that were behaving strangely, avoiding certain areas, moving in patterns that suggested they were being herded by something. The trail had led me to a research facility hidden in a box canyon, surrounded by enough security to guard Fort Knox. Through night vision binoculars, I'd watched things that my mind still struggled to process. "I remember being told it was for national security," I said carefully. "It was, and still is." Cross gestured toward the campsite. "Madison Clark found what you found, but unlike you, she didn't report it through proper channels. She started asking questions, taking pictures, posting on social media about government conspiracies and secret experiments." He pulled out a tablet and showed me Madison's Facebook page from 8 years ago. The posts were exactly what he'd described. Blurry photos of helicopters, complaints about military presence in national parks, theories about illegal research. The kind of posts that most people would dismiss as paranoid rambling. "So you silenced her," I said, the words coming out flatter than I intended. "We tried to. Standard protocol. Bring her in, explain the situation, get her to sign confidentiality agreements. But she ran. Disappeared into the backcountry before we could make contact. We assumed she died of exposure or animal attack. Case closed. File archived." Cross paused, looking up at the canopy where helicopter rotors were still beating steady rhythms. "But yesterday her backpack reappeared, and this morning our perimeter sensors detected a breach in the restricted zone. Something got out, Ranger Carter. Something that's been contained for 8 years just broke free." The pieces were falling together in ways that made my stomach clench. Madison hadn't died of exposure 8 years ago. She'd found something, been captured by something, and had been missing ever since. And now that something was free, and it had kept her backpack as a trophy. "What exactly escaped?" I asked. Cross was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its professional distance. Project Chimera was shut down in 2010 after containment failures. Genetic modification research combining human DNA with adaptive traits from apex predators. The goal was enhanced soldiers, stronger, faster, more resilient than normal humans. He gestured toward the bone markers surrounding the dark patch of Earth. This is what we were afraid of. Subject 7 broke containment 8 years ago, just as Madison Clark was asking too many questions. We thought we'd lost both of them in the wilderness. But Subject 7 survived, and it's been learning. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Madison Clark hadn't just disappeared. She'd been taken by something that was part human, part engineered predator. And for 8 years, that thing had been living in the deep wilderness, evolving, adapting, possibly experimenting on other victims. How many people have gone missing in this area since 2010? I asked. Cross consulted his tablet. Officially, Madison Clark was the only unexplained disappearance. Unofficially, we've been monitoring 17 cases across 3 counties. Hikers, campers, hunters, all in areas adjacent to the original containment zone. 17 people. And now their remains were arranged like trophies around a campsite that technology couldn't properly photograph. Whatever Subject 7 had become, it was intelligent enough to stay hidden and methodical enough to keep hunting. Where is it now? I asked. We don't know. That's why you're here. Cross pointed deeper into the forest toward areas of Olympic that rarely saw human visitors. Subject 7 knows these woods better than anyone except maybe you. We need someone who can track it, predict its movements, help us reestablish containment before it makes its way to populated areas. The rational part of my mind was screaming warnings. This was exactly how my last encounter with classified projects had started. A simple request for help that had turned into months of nightmares and years of mandatory therapy. But the ranger part of my mind, the part that had sworn to protect these forests and the people who use them, couldn't walk away from 17 missing people. What happened to the original research team? I asked. Dead. All of them. Cross's voice was matter of fact. Subject 7 killed them during the containment breach. That's why the project was terminated and the facility abandoned. We thought the subject had died in the wilderness, but obviously, we were wrong. He handed me a file folder marked with classifications I didn't recognize. Inside were photographs that made my hands shake, not from fear, but from recognition. The creature in the photos looked almost human from a distance, but the details were all wrong. Too tall, too lean, with proportions that suggested bones had been lengthened and muscle mass redistributed. Its hands ended in claws that could have carved the symbols I'd seen around the campsite. And its face. Its face was Madison Clark's, but changed. The bone structure was the same, the eye color identical to her driver's license photo. But something looked out through those eyes that was no longer entirely human. Jesus Christ, I whispered. It didn't just capture her, it changed her. The transformation process was part of the original research, Cross explained. Subjects were infected with an engineered retrovirus that rewrote their DNA over time. Most died within weeks, but a few adapted. Subject 7 was the only one that fully completed the metamorphosis. I stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the college student from the missing person posters with the predator looking back at me from the classified files. Madison Clark had been transformed into something that retained her memories and intelligence, but operated on entirely different instincts. What does it want? I asked. Based on behavioral analysis, it's trying to reproduce. The genetic modifications included enhanced reproductive capabilities, but it needs compatible hosts. That's probably why it's been taking people. It's experimenting, trying to create others like itself. The bone markers around the campsite suddenly made more sense. Failed experiments. People who hadn't survived the transformation process. For 8 years, Madison Clark had been alone in the wilderness, trying to create a family or a pack or whatever social structure drove her new biology. And now it's getting bolder, I said, understanding beginning to dawn. The backpack appearing, the campsite being discovered. It wants to be found. Cross nodded. Our analysts think it's reached some kind of developmental threshold. Maybe it's finally succeeded in creating a viable offspring. Or maybe it's simply reached the limits of what it can accomplish alone. Either way, it's moving toward human populations. That meant people in Port Angeles, Forks, even Seattle were at risk. Whatever Madison Clark had become, she was intelligent enough to plan and strong enough to execute those plans. And she had 8 years of wilderness survival experience that made her nearly impossible to track through conventional means. "I'll help," I said, closing the file folder. "But I want full disclosure this time. No more classified surprises, no more need-to-know restrictions. If I'm going to track this thing, I need to know everything." Cross considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Agreed. But understand, Ranger Carter, that knowledge comes with consequences. After this is over, you'll never be able to return to normal duties. Some information changes you permanently." I thought about the 17 missing people, about Madison Clark's 8 years of isolation and transformation, about the possibility of this situation expanding beyond the wilderness. Some choices don't really feel like choices at all. "Let's go hunting," I said. "What would you do in this situation? Would you keep searching or turn back?" Let me know in the comments below and subscribe for more Supernatural Ranger stories. The trail that Cross's team followed into the deep forest wasn't marked on any map. It wound through old-growth cedars and across creek beds that had been dry for decades, following what looked like game trails, but felt like something more deliberate. After 3 hours of hiking, we reached a razor wire perimeter that had been cut through in several places. "Original containment boundary," Cross explained, pointing to the numbered posts that marked the fence line. "Electrified until 2012, then converted to passive monitoring. Motion sensors, cameras, seismic detectors. Everything was functioning normally until yesterday morning." He showed me the breach point, a section where the wire had been carefully cut and rolled back, creating an opening just wide enough for a human-sized figure. But the cuts were too clean, too precise. Whatever had made them possessed fine motor control that belied the predatory nature suggested by the claw marks I'd seen earlier. "Subject 7 retained human intelligence," Cross said, reading my expression. "Enhanced it, actually. IQ tests before transformation showed Madison Clark was gifted but not exceptional. Post-transformation behavioral analysis suggests she's operating at near-genius levels." Beyond the perimeter, the forest changed. It was subtle at first, trees growing in slightly unnatural patterns, understory vegetation that seemed more lush than it should be in October. But as we hiked deeper, the changes became more pronounced. The very air felt different, thicker somehow, with an ozone smell that reminded me of electrical storms. "Environmental contamination," Cross explained when I mentioned it. "The original research involved atmospheric dispersal of genetic modification agents. Most of it broke down after the facility was abandoned, but some areas still show elevated readings. That explained the plant growth, but it didn't explain the complete absence of wildlife. In 12 years of ranging these forests, I'd never encountered an area so devoid of animal life. No bird calls, no rustle of small mammals, no insects. Just an unnatural silence that made our footsteps sound unnaturally loud. After another hour, we reached the facility, or what was left of it. The complex had been built into the side of a ridge, camouflaged so well that it was invisible until you were almost on top of it. Concrete and steel construction, designed to withstand both natural disasters and human attack. But something had torn through the reinforced walls like they were made of cardboard. "Containment breach occurred in Laboratory 7, Cross said, leading us through twisted metal doors that hung at impossible angles. Subject 7 was undergoing final phase testing when something went wrong. Inside, the facility was a maze of collapsed corridors and flooded chambers. Emergency lighting cast red shadows on walls that were scored with claw marks, some shallow, others deep enough to gouge concrete. In the main laboratory, banks of computers still hummed with power, displaying data streams that meant nothing to me but made Cross's team exchange worried glances. "The AI is still active," one of the agents reported. "It's been running continuous analysis for 8 years, tracking Subject 7's development through environmental sensors." Cross moved to the main terminal and began typing commands. After a few minutes, a holographic display materialized above the computer bank, showing a three-dimensional map of the Olympic Peninsula marked with thousands of red dots. Movement tracking, he explained. Each dot represents a confirmed sighting by automated sensors. Watch the pattern over time. The display began to animate, showing 8 years of data in accelerated time. At first, the red dots clustered around the facility, random and scattered. But gradually, they began to form patterns. Hunting routes that extended farther from the facility each year. Regular patrol circuits that suggested territorial behavior. And finally, recent data that showed concentrated activity near human population centers. It's been learning, I said, watching the patterns emerge. Not just surviving, but studying human behavior, mapping our settlements. More than that, Cross said, zooming in on the most recent data. Look at the timing of these incursions. They correspond exactly with missing person reports. Subject 7 has been actively hunting humans for at least 5 years. But it was the latest cluster of red dots that made my blood freeze. They formed a rough circle around Port Angeles, with concentrated activity along the hiking trails that thousands of visitors used every year. Madison Clark wasn't just hunting randomly anymore. She was positioning herself to hunt systematically. How long before it reaches the town? I asked. Cross consulted the data streams. Based on movement patterns, maybe 72 hours, but that assumes it maintains current behavioral patterns. If it's accelerating its development cycle, it could be much sooner. One of the agents called out from across the laboratory. Agent Cross, you need to see this. We followed him to a chamber that had obviously been used for containment. Reinforced walls, observation windows, multiple security doors. But the containment cell was empty, its reinforced door torn off its hinges from the inside. What caught our attention were the walls. Every surface was covered with writing, not carved with claws, but written in what looked like blood. The handwriting was small and precise, covering every available space with text that hurt to look at directly. Not because it was illegible, but because it was too legible, too organized, too obviously the product of a mind that had spent 8 years in solitary confinement with nothing to do but think. Can you read any of it? Cross asked. I moved closer, squinting at the cramped text. Most of it seemed to be scientific notations, formulas, calculations, genetic sequences, but scattered throughout were personal entries that read like journal posts. Day 847. The hunger is getting stronger. Not for food, but for connection. The loneliness is worse than the physical changes. I remember being human, but those memories feel like stories someone told me about another person. Day 1203. Successful integration with local ecosystem. Deer population has adapted to my presence. They understand I'm not their predator. I'm something new. Something better. Day 2156. The facility AI continues to provide educational resources, advanced biochemistry, genetic engineering, behavioral psychology. I'm learning things that would have taken decades in graduate school. Evolution is an accelerated process when you have the right tools. Day 2847. I understand the purpose now. They created me to be the first but not the last. I'm supposed to reproduce, to create others. But the process requires careful selection. Not everyone can survive the transformation. The final entry was dated just 3 days ago. Day 2.912, time to end the isolation. I've learned everything I can from solitude. The next phase requires interaction with my original species. They'll resist at first, but they'll understand eventually. Everyone wants to evolve. She's been planning this for 8 years, I said, stepping back from the wall. The missing hikers, the failed experiments. She's been perfecting the transformation process, and now she thinks she's ready for large-scale implementation. Cross was already on his radio, calling for additional teams. But I knew it was too late for traditional containment. Whatever Madison Clark had become, she'd had 8 years to study human behavior and 8 years to plan. She wouldn't be caught by conventional military tactics. We need to get ahead of her, I said. Think like she thinks. Where would she go to find the most suitable subjects? Cross pulled up a map of the area on his tablet. Population centers are obvious targets: Port Angeles, Forks, Sequim. But she's been avoiding direct confrontation with large groups. Her hunting pattern suggests she prefers isolated individuals or small groups. I studied the map, thinking about Madison's psychology before and after transformation. College student, outdoorsy, social, but not reckless. She'd chosen Olympic National Park for her original camping trip because it offered solitude and natural beauty. Now, as something no longer entirely human, where would she go to find people who reminded her of her former self? The campgrounds, I said suddenly. She's not hunting randomly, she's hunting people like herself. Young, adventurous, outdoorsy types who come to the park for the same reasons she did 8 years ago. Cross nodded slowly. Halloween weekend is coming up. University groups, hiking clubs, adventure tourism. The campgrounds will be full of exactly the demographic she's been targeting. The realization hit us both at the same time. Halloween weekend in Olympic National Park meant hundreds of young people camping in remote areas, many of them alone or in small groups. For something that had spent 8 years perfecting predatory techniques, it would be like a hunting preserve stocked with ideal prey. We have maybe 24 hours to find her before she reaches the main camping areas, Cross said. After that, we're looking at a mass casualty event. But even as he said it, we both knew the conventional approach wouldn't work. Madison Clark had 8 years of preparation, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and physical capabilities that far exceeded human norms. She'd been planning this for longer than we'd been aware she existed. I have an idea, I said, but you're not going to like it. Cross looked at me with the expression of a man who'd already had too many unpleasant surprises. What are you thinking? We can't hunt her, I said. She knows these woods better than we do, and she's faster and stronger than any pursuit team. But we might be able to attract her. Bait, Cross said, understanding immediately. You want to use yourself as bait. Not just me, all of us. But we need to make her think she's hunting us, when actually, we're leading her where we want her to go. I pointed to the facility map on his tablet. This place has containment protocols that were designed for something exactly like her. If we can lure her back here, we might be able to trap her. Cross was already shaking his head. Too risky. Subject 7 has had 8 years to study this facility. She knows every weakness, every exit, every system. Maybe, but she also has 8 years of emotional attachment to this place. Look at those wall writings. This is where she became what she is. It's not just a prison to her. It's her birthplace. If we can trigger the right psychological response, curiosity might override caution. The plan was insane, but it was the only plan that had any chance of preventing mass casualties. And deep down, I knew there was another reason I wanted to face Madison Clark directly. 3 years ago, I'd walked away from the impossible without understanding what I'd seen. This time, I needed to finish what had been started. All right, Cross said finally, but we do this by the book. Full containment protocols, redundant backup systems, and if anything goes wrong, we evacuate and call in an airstrike. Agreed, I said, though I suspected that if anything went wrong, evacuation wouldn't be an option. We had 18 hours to prepare a trap for something that had spent 8 years learning to hunt humans. The odds weren't good, but they were the only odds we had. The sun was setting by the time we'd established our perimeter around the facility. Cross's team had managed to restore partial power to the containment systems, and the AI had been reprogrammed to respond to our commands instead of continuing its endless analysis of Subject 7's behavioral patterns. I'd positioned myself at the main entrance, carrying equipment that had been carefully selected to make me look like a solo researcher rather than part of a military operation. The story was simple. I was a graduate student conducting follow-up research on the abandoned facility, unaware of any danger. The kind of vulnerable, isolated target that Madison Clark had been hunting for years. Remember, Cross said through my earpiece, you're not trying to capture her. Just get her inside the facility where we can activate containment. If she suspects a trap, abort immediately. But as darkness fell over the Olympic wilderness, I realized that Madison Clark wasn't going to fall for any deception. She'd been hunting humans for 8 years, and she'd survived in these woods by being smarter and more careful than anything that tried to hunt her in return. When she finally appeared, it was nothing like I'd expected. She didn't emerge from the forest like a stalking predator. She didn't use stealth or surprise or any of the tactics that the military profiles suggested. Instead, Madison Clark simply walked up the main trail to the facility, moving with the confident stride of someone returning home after a long absence. In the dying light, she looked almost human. Tall and lean, with blonde hair that hung past her shoulders and clothes that might have belonged to any backcountry hiker. But there were subtle wrongnesses that became more apparent as she drew closer. Her movements were too fluid, like she had additional joints in places where humans didn't. Her proportions were slightly off, as if someone had taken a human form and stretched it by 10% in every direction, and her eyes reflected light like an animal's. "Dr. Carter," she said as she approached, and her voice was Madison Clark's voice, unchanged after 8 years. "I've been watching you for several hours. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the surveillance teams positioned around the perimeter?" My blood turned to ice water. She knew. She'd known from the beginning that this was a trap, and she'd come anyway. "Hello, Madison," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk." She smiled, and I saw that her teeth were wrong too. Not fangs or anything obviously predatory, but too sharp, too numerous, arranged in rows that suggested a fundamental redesign of human dental architecture. "Yes," she said, "we do. But not out here. This conversation needs to happen where it began." She walked past me toward the facility entrance, and despite every instinct screaming warnings, I followed. Because whatever Madison Clark had become, she was still the victim in this situation. She hadn't chosen to be transformed into something no longer entirely human. And maybe, somewhere beneath the genetic modifications and behavioral adaptations, enough of the original person remained to be reached. That hope lasted until we entered Laboratory 7. The chamber had been cleaned since our earlier visit, the blood-written walls scrubbed clean and the twisted metal replaced. But Madison moved through the space like she owned it, touching control panels and examining equipment with the familiarity of someone who'd spent years studying every detail. "You can tell your teams to come inside," she said without turning around. "All 6 agents positioned around the building, plus Agent Cross in the control room. I know they're there because I've been studying their behavioral patterns for the past 3 days." I pressed my earpiece to respond, but Madison's hand was suddenly on my wrist, moving faster than human reflexes could follow. Her grip was gentle but unbreakable, and her skin felt wrong, too warm, with a texture that suggested scales rather than flesh. "Radio silence from here on," she said. "This is between us." "What do you want, Madison?" I asked. "I want you to understand," she said, finally turning to face me fully. Up close, the changes were impossible to ignore. Her facial structure had been altered, with a pronounced brow ridge and cheekbones that created deep shadows around her eyes. Her neck was longer than it should be, and when she moved her head, I could see muscle definitions that didn't exist in normal human anatomy. But her eyes were still human. Intelligent, lonely, and filled with a sadness that 8 years of isolation hadn't diminished. "Understand what?" I prompted. "Why I did this," she said, gesturing to the laboratory around us. "Why I've been taking people, experimenting, trying to create others like myself. You think I'm a monster, and by human standards, maybe I am. But humans aren't the end point of evolution, Dr. Carter. They're just another step in the process." She moved to a bank of computers and began typing commands. Images appeared on the wall displays, genetic sequences, biological models, projection analyses that were far beyond my understanding. "The transformation isn't random," she continued. "It's directed evolution, accelerated through genetic modification, but guided by conscious intelligence. I've become something new, something better adapted to survive in environments that would kill ordinary humans." "But the people you've taken," I said, "the ones who didn't survive the transformation, they were murdered." Madison's expression didn't change. They were volunteers who didn't understand the risks. Evolution has always been a process with casualties. The strong survive, the weak perish, and the species advances. I'm simply applying conscious direction to a process that nature handles through random selection. That's not evolution, I said. That's genocide. Is it? Madison turned back to the displays, showing projections that made my stomach clench. Climate change is accelerating. Ocean acidification, atmospheric toxicity, resource depletion. Within 50 years, the environmental conditions on Earth will be hostile to current human biology. But my modifications allow survival in those conditions. Enhanced immune system, improved toxin resistance, greater physical resilience. I'm not creating monsters, Dr. Carter. I'm creating the next version of humanity. The logic was horrifying in its rationality. Madison Clark hadn't become a mindless predator. She'd become something far more dangerous. A visionary who genuinely believed she was saving the human species by transforming it into something no longer recognizably human. The people in the campgrounds, I said. You're planning to transform them whether they consent or not. Consent is a luxury that species can't afford when facing extinction, Madison replied. Every person I transform increases the chances that humanity, in some form, will survive the coming environmental collapse. They'll resist initially, but they'll thank me eventually. When the oceans boil and the atmosphere becomes toxic, my creations will be the only humans left alive. She was completely sincere. 8 years of isolation had allowed her enhanced intelligence to develop a worldview that justified any action in service of her perceived greater good. She saw herself not as a predator but as a savior, and that made her infinitely more dangerous than any mindless monster. Madison, I said carefully, you're talking about forced transformation of hundreds of people. That's not salvation. That's mass murder. Death is temporary, she said, touching a control panel that brought the facility's containment systems online. Evolution is permanent, and the process has already begun. The laboratory doors sealed themselves with a sound like a bank vault closing. Emergency lights bathed everything in red, and I could hear the hum of machinery coming online throughout the facility. But it wasn't trapping Madison. It was trapping me. You see, Madison continued, I've spent the last 3 days studying you specifically, Dr. Carter. Your psychological profile, your physical fitness, your genetic markers. You're an ideal candidate for transformation. Strong enough to survive the process, intelligent enough to understand its necessity, and isolated enough that your disappearance won't trigger immediate investigation. I backed toward the sealed door, but Madison made no move to follow. She didn't need to. Whatever she'd done to the facility's systems had turned Laboratory 7 into an inescapable prison. The process will take approximately 72 hours, she said, moving to another control panel. The initial viral infection is painless. You'll feel like you have a mild flu for the first day. The genetic restructuring begins on day 2, and that's significantly more uncomfortable. But by day 3, you'll start to understand what you're becoming. Aerosol vents opened in the walls, and I could see a faint mist beginning to fill the chamber. The transformation virus, engineered 8 years ago and perfected through experimentation on 17 unwilling subjects. Cross, I shouted into my earpiece, but got only static in response. Madison had disabled communications along with the door controls. Agent Cross and his team are fine, Madison said. They're locked in the control room where they'll remain until the transformation is complete. I need witnesses to document the process, but I don't need them interfering. The mist was getting thicker, and I could taste something metallic in the air. My lungs were burning, and I could feel my throat beginning to close. Whatever the transformation virus was, it worked fast. Why me? I gasped. Madison smiled again, and for just a moment, she looked like the college student from the missing person photos. Because you're the only person who's seen what I've become and hasn't run away. That suggests you have the psychological resilience necessary to complete the transformation. Most people break during the process, but you're stronger than most. She was right about one thing: I wasn't running. Not because I was brave, but because there was nowhere to run to. The laboratory was sealed, the virus was in my lungs, and in 72 hours, I would either be dead or transformed into something like the creature standing before me. But Madison had made one critical error. She'd assumed that I was alone, that Cross's team was just passive observers locked in the control room. She didn't know about the secondary containment protocols that I'd helped design 3 hours earlier. "Madison," I said, my voice getting rougher as the virus took hold, "there's something you need to know about this facility." "What's that?" she asked, genuinely curious. "It was designed to contain something exactly like you," I said, and triggered the dead man switch that Cross had built into my equipment. The explosion wasn't large, just enough to breach the laboratory's containment seal and activate the facility's emergency lockdown protocols. But it was sufficient to flood Laboratory 7 with a concentrated burst of electromagnetic energy that disabled every electronic system in the room, including the life support systems that had been keeping Madison's enhanced metabolism stable. She collapsed instantly, her modified biology unable to function without the technological support she'd built into the facility. 8 years of genetic modification had made her stronger and smarter than any human, but it had also made her dependent on systems that could be turned against her. The laboratory doors opened as emergency power restored basic functions, and Cross's team poured into the chamber wearing full hazmat gear. They surrounded Madison's unconscious form while I collapsed against the wall, the transformation virus burning through my bloodstream like acid. "Get her into cryogenic containment," Cross ordered, "and get Dr. Carter to the medical bay. We need to start antiviral treatment immediately." But even as they carried me out of Laboratory 7, I knew it was too late. The virus was already rewriting my DNA, beginning changes that would take 72 hours to complete. I could feel my bones beginning to ache as they prepared to lengthen, and my vision was starting to shift into spectral ranges that human eyes weren't designed to see. Madison Clark had been stopped, but not before completing her final experiment. In trying to save 17 missing people and prevent hundreds more from being transformed, I'd become the 18th victim of Project Chimera. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my effort to prevent the creation of more monsters, I'd become one myself. Did you enjoy this supernatural encounter? What would you have done differently? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying tales from the wilderness. Epilogue, 72 days later. My name is Emily Carter, and I'm writing this from a containment facility that doesn't officially exist. The transformation was successful, if you can call it that. My bones lengthened by 12%. My muscle mass increased by 40%, and my sensory capabilities now extend into ranges that humans can't perceive. I'm still me, mostly. My memories are intact, my personality unchanged, my fundamental values preserved. But I'm also something new, something that can see in complete darkness and hear conversations from miles away and smell the fierce sweat of prey animals before they even know they're afraid. Madison Clark was right about one thing: the transformation creates beings better adapted to survive in hostile environments. What she was wrong about was the psychological cost of that adaptation. Every day, I fight urges that feel natural, but horrify the part of me that's still human. The hunger isn't just for food, it's for contact, for connection, for the creation of others like myself. The loneliness is the worst part. I understand now why Madison took people, why she tried to transform them. When you're the only one of your kind, isolation becomes a form of torture that even enhanced biology can't endure. Agent Cross visits me weekly. He tells me about the research being conducted on Madison's genetic modifications, about the attempts to develop treatments for the transformation virus, about the ongoing search for the 17 missing people who might still be alive somewhere in the Olympic wilderness. He also tells me about the sightings. Creatures moving through the forests of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. Tracks that don't match any known animal. Missing persons cases that follow patterns eerily similar to Madison's hunting behavior. Project Chimera was officially terminated in 2010, but Madison Clark spent 8 years perfecting the transformation process, and she wasn't the only test subject who escaped containment. She was just the first one smart enough to survive long enough to reproduce. The transformation is spreading, slowly, carefully, but inevitably. And somewhere in the deep wilderness, others like Madison and me are learning to hunt, to hide, and to create more of our kind. I could escape this facility. My enhanced capabilities make current containment protocols inadequate, but I stay because I remember being human, and I know that what I've become represents an existential threat to my original species. The question that keeps me awake during the long nights is whether that threat is intentional or inevitable. Are we predators, or are we simply the next step in human evolution, guided by intelligence but driven by instincts we can't fully control? Madison believed she was saving humanity by transforming it. Cross believes he's saving humanity by containing us. But maybe the truth is that humanity, as it currently exists, is simply not adapted to survive the challenges of the next century. Maybe we are the future, whether anyone wants us to be or not. The hunger grows stronger every day. Soon, I'll have to choose between the human I was and the creature I'm becoming. And when that choice is made, there won't be any going back. For any of us. End of transmission. File archived under Project Chimera, classification level, extinction protocol.